Hi, I'm Kim Rubenstein. I'm a professor of law at the University of Canberra, and I started teaching constitutional law in 1993.
And hi, I'm James Blackwell. I'm a Wiradjuri man and research fellow at the ANU and member of the Uluru Dialogue at UNSW.
This year is such an important year for the Australian Constitution because we're being asked to change it. Now, if you want to change something, you really have to know what it is that you're changing. So this podcast series is to introduce you to the Australian Constitution, all aspects of it, to help you when you make your decision about this referendum.
So join us for this 8-part series as we explore the Constitution, the law, the vibe of the thing, and Indigenous issues in this really important referendum year.
And indeed, it's not just the vibe, it's the Constitution.
In summing up, it's the Constitution, it's Mabo, it's justice, it's law, it's the vibe, and no, that's it, it's the vibe.
That was sensational.
So this podcast session is going to concentrate on the Crown and the role of the Crown in the Australian Constitution and some other links that are relevant, obviously, to the voice in our desire for people to know more about the Constitution to better understand their role in voting at this year's 2023 referendum.
So yeah, just to be a little bit subversive, Kim, we are on Wiradjuri country this week, my country, outside of Canberra. Giving ourselves perhaps a bit of perspective on some of these issues.
Yes, I think it was important to ground this series with some of them being recorded at the University of Canberra, some of them being recorded at the Museum of Australian Democracy, and some of them being recorded specifically chosen on Wiradjuri country. So thanks for the opportunity, James, for us to do that and to ensure that recognition at the beginning of this session.
It's great to be out here. Of course, I should also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on whose lands we have been recording thus far, but yes,
Indeed.
It is great to be here on my country. Always good to return and have this discussion out here.
And Wiradjuri country is quite a large region, isn't it?
Yeah, so it goes all the way from Albury in the south up to sort of Dubbo in the north, and from about Harden and Young in the east, all the way out to Narendra, a bit past Narendra even. In the west, a fairly big region, but we are on a sort of closer end to Canberra. We're definitely not out in Dubbo today.
No, and I must admit that the drive out here was just glorious. So it's a nice way to ground ourselves in country by making that trip and also acknowledging it. But we go back to acknowledging in a different sort of way the reality is that this Australian Constitution is actually a British document or a British piece of legislation. So in our history section, we talked about the 1890s and the convention debates and it being a document that was developed by the individuals in the colonies, not necessarily a vastly representative group of people, but certainly people who had been elected at the time. But when they finished their various discussions and drafting, it had to be passed as a piece of legislation in the British Parliament. And it is actually, if you open up your constitutions, those of you who have been encouraged enough to go and get your little pocket copy, it begins with 63 and 64 Victoria, Chapter 12, an Act to constitute the Commonwealth of Australia, the 9th of July 1900. So our constitution is embedded in a British Act of Parliament.
I mean, given our history, it's not entirely unsurprising that that's the case though, Kim, right?
That's right, exactly. In terms of the colonial origins, that makes a lot of sense. So here we are recognising, I guess, the colonial structure that it's part of, but it was in that context one in which we were reminded that the Crown is sort of central to the Constitution, and there are other aspects that shine through in relation to that. And so one of the things that I just thought I would remind people, because of course it says the Queen all the way through this Constitution, the references.
Which is not a reference to Queen Elizabeth.
No, indeed. And in fact, Section 2 of that British Act says the provisions of this Act referring to the Queen shall extend to Her Majesty's heirs and successors in the sovereignty of the United Kingdom.
It's definitely a quirk, though, that we've had two queens. And for a fair 70 years of the Constitution, it's only been around 120 odd years. So
yes,
the majority
exactly.
of the time there was actually a queen. So this kind of specificity was irrelevant in that there was no king.
Yes.
To refer to. Obviously now we have a king, but up until last year, the fact that it was queen kind of almost was
The norm.
the norm, yeah.
And in fact, in discussions about gender and head of state, that was often one of the things that I would refer to, that obviously through hereditary rather than through a gender preference, we had actually had a woman as a head of state for a very long time. But those structures, of course, were quirky rather than a sense of fairness or equality between genders.
Of course, there was that very short period, Kim, where we had a female queen, female governor-general and female Prime Minister.
And female Attorney General, all at once. And then very quickly that changed. So, the question of how you embed those norms of women having those leadership roles is probably another podcast in and of itself. But the Queen appears throughout this constitution, but of course we know that the head of state, as the Queen, is represented in Australia by the Governor-General. And in fact, there is a specific reference to the fact in our constitution that the Governor-General is appointed by the Queen and is Her Majesty's representative and exercises in the Commonwealth during the Queen's pleasure, but subject to this constitution, the powers and functions that are provided to the Queen. And I think it is interesting to note that when the head of state, the Crown is in Australia, the Crown takes precedence over the Governor-General. So that sort of reinforces the continuity of the Crown's power, in essence, in one of the many ways that shows.
I can only think of one time, though, where the Crown itself, as in the Queen, or in this case King, has actually come and signed a piece of legislation in Australia.
And when was of that? Because that's knowledge I'm not aware of.
The Australia Act in the 80s.
1988, yes.
Which was when the Queen was here for the bicentennial.
Yep.
She wasn't required to, but did sign a copy of the Australia Act, which kind of formalised a break almost from this system, or at least a sort of a slow removal of kind of proximity, at least.
Yeah, that's really interesting, James, because in a way, she would have been signing it twice in that context, because this is one of the interesting things about the nature of the Crown, the sort of divisibility of the Crown. So we have an English person as our head of state, and this becomes relevant for when we discuss the Republic later in this session. But in essence, the Crown as our head of state is the Crown in the right of Australia. So he now is the Australian Crown and is a person who is divisible depending on the various different territories over which the Crown presides. So it's this sort of legal fiction. But in reality, your point is emphasising that in some ways, in 1988, when she signed if she signed off on the Commonwealth Australia Acts, which were to provide more independence in legislation and executive power in Australia, that she would have been signing off both as the head of England as well as the head of Australia. So there you go, multiple personalities.
One time that's occurred.
Yeah,
that
interesting.
I'm aware of. It could be another.
We might get people writing in to tell us if that is not the only time. But in essence, it does remind us of that colonial sort of representation all the way through the Constitution. And one of the other aspects of it is, as we talked about in separation of powers, we've got Chapter 1 setting out the legislative power, and we think of our parliament. But in fact, Section 1 says that the legislative power of the Commonwealth is vested in a federal parliament, which shall consist of the Queen, a Senate and a House of Representatives. And that comes back to your reminder that every piece of legislation essentially has to be signed off by the Crown.
Unlike in America, there's no veto power, so there's not this. I think some of us kind of have this view of US presidents vetoing legislation, going, "No, I will not sign that." It's not the case here in Australia. The Queen or the Governor-General or the Governor, if you're at a state level, doesn't have that power by convention.
That's right.
Could in effect do it, but it would be highly unusual.
This is interesting as a point to introduce, which we may not have gone into great detail in the other sessions, about the role of conventions and practice in the ways in which these various sections of the Constitution are played out. So one of the conventions associated with the Governor-General being the representative of the Crown is that the Governor-General acts on the advice of the elected ministers. So the Prime Minister and the Federal Executive Council, which is actually set up within the constitutional framework, is there to advise the Governor-General. But there have been a couple of instances, James, where the Governor-General has asked the Prime Minister to go back and consider various aspects of what they're seeking to pass. Sir Ninian Stephen, I think with Bob Hawke was one example, I think in relation to double dissolution. So it is it's clearly a convention that on the whole you would find
And
that...
of course, we have the very famous John Kerr example of not necessarily following the advice of the Prime Minister at the time.
That's absolutely right. So
Sorry to
not,
bring it up too early. But I think it's the elephant in the room for everyone's mind is, but yeah, John Kerr sacked the government. Yes, that's probably the most known example of a Governor-General doing something out of the ordinary.
And so that's right. To contextualise that, when I talk about Sir Ninian Stephen, there wasn't perhaps anything too revolutionary, even though it wasn't the norm for the Governor-General to ask the Prime Minister to come back with further information before the Governor-General signs off. But as you referred to, in 1975, the Governor-General acted unilaterally by not consulting with the Prime Minister and, in fact, deliberately not consulting the Prime Minister in deciding to sack Gough Whitlam. And that is another aspect of constitutional history that wraps into the question of a republic and whether it's more appropriate.
And there's some great work done by Jenny Hocking, who's the historian on Sir John Kerr and Gough Whitlam in that period, and
Yes.
recommend others to go read and
Palace
listen to her
Letters.
work, because
Yes.
she really kind of broke ground on a lot of that stuff, especially with regards to the High Court and pursuing some of the secrecy around documents related to that period.
And again, to put it into to sort of amplify its current value for thinking about the role of the Crown, a lot of people say, well, the Crown really doesn't have any impact on day-to-day life in Australia because the Governor-General is an Australian, and in fact the Governor-General has been an Australian since 1931. For the first 30 years of our Commonwealth, we had British Governors-General who were appointed to come to Australia or to represent the Queen in Australia. But in 1931, the government of the day recommended to the Crown Sir Isaac Isaacs, who had been a High Court judge and had been one of the drafters and framers of the Constitution, as the first Australian-born Governor-General. And so a lot of people say, well, we've got an Australian effectively as a head of state. But Jenny's work is a reminder that the role of the Crown and the English framework still has an impact on decisions in Australia, because the National Library of Australia had sought to preclude Jenny as a historian from accessing certain palace letters, and that's another whole story in itself.
It doesn't just preclude Jenny, it precludes all of us as the Australian public from seeing that as well, right? It's not just merely the act of one historian being denied that thing, but actually they were saying that the Crown is so above all of these things that we as the Australian public aren't allowed to look at them.
Indeed.
I think is the bigger question.
And
the
the
implication, sorry.
Yes, and the High Court found in Jenny's favour as the applicant in that, but in the people's favour in the sense that veto was not overriding. But it's I think the reminder is of the reality of the structural framework that we operate in, where the Crown and King Charles is the formal head of state, and that is a continuing part of our constitutional structure. The other thing I wanted to just refer to, again linking back to our other podcasts, is section 61, because I've just explained that the Crown is referred to in section 1 in terms of the Parliament itself, but that's of course in a separation of power sense. When we come to the executive branch, the Queen is the head, or the Crown is the head of the executive branch, and section 61 specifically says that the executive power of the Commonwealth is vested in the Queen and is exercisable by the Governor-General as the Queen's representative, and extends to the execution and maintenance of this Constitution and the laws of the Constitution. So again, the primacy of the Crown as the head of the executive branch is really key to our system of separation of powers. And is also key to sort of notions of responsible government and the influence of the English system on our constitutional structure.
And it extends everywhere. I mean, it's not just beyond government, but into the legal system as well. I mean, for those of us who are Law and Order fans on the podcast, like myself, you may be aware of the People versus X in the way that the US cases are conducted in the criminal sense. The People versus Smith, or People versus Rubenstein.
Yes.
If Kim's ever committed a crime in America. That's not how that works here, though, is it, Kim?
No, it's not. So it's the Crown, exactly. So the
Crown is the
representation of the state.
The Crown is the injured party, not in some sense. In some countries, have the people or the state. But
Good point.
The Crown, the Queen or the King in this case, is the injured party.
Yes.
That's pursuing the case.
Yeah. So these influences are are not only symbolic but structural and have significant sort of consequences in terms of our day-to-day lives. And James, I wondered if it would also be good to talk about, we referenced Uncle Jimmy Clements when we were sitting at Old Parliament House as attending the opening of that building of the first Commonwealth Parliament in Canberra, and about Indigenous people's relationship to the Crown.
Yeah, so we're here on Wiradjuri country, as we said earlier, and we're not terribly far from where Uncle Jimmy and Uncle John Noble started their walk to Parliament, probably about 50 minutes down the road from where we are right now. And Indigenous relationship with the Crown is a complex one, right? And we've talked earlier in other episodes about us as British subject without full British subject status necessarily, and
yes,
or at least without the full rights of British subjects
exactly.
in that period. So that's a really interesting relationship with regards to that. I think the Uncle Jimmy and Uncle John story really speaks to, I think, the sovereignty question of the Crown, because what that means in the Constitution is the Crown is the sovereign. The Crown has that exercise of power, whereas for us, we are our own sovereigns. We have our own sovereignty, and we've never ceded that. We've never given that away to anybody. And it creates, the discussion of the Crown really brings forward this tension, right, of not necessarily competing sovereignties, but overlapping sovereignties, where us as Indigenous peoples have still asserted our claims to sovereignty, as Uncle Jimmy Clements and Uncle John Noble did in 1927 when they walked to Parliament from Brungle. But it exists beyond them. It's not just, they aren't the only example of this. I'm thinking of Uncle William Cooper in 1937, and he's just one example. But where Indigenous peoples have petitioned the Crown, not the colonial government, not the government here in Australia, but petitioned the Imperial Centre for rights and for recognition of sovereignty. And just for those who aren't aware, 1937, William Cooper, a Yorta Yorta elder from Victoria, went around the country getting signatures from Aboriginal people to present to the King. At the time was King George was 37, so it'd be King George the Sixth in that period. Got to get my history right there. But that was never delivered, of course, to the King. The Australian government felt it was inappropriate and unnecessary to give the King such a document. But I think it speaks to this recognition from our people that the Crown is the power here, not necessarily the Australian government. And that petition is just one of dozens of examples of these petitions where we've, again, in the 1800s, 1900s, Aboriginal people petitioning the Crown, Britain, the King in London,
yes,
or the Queen in London for
yeah,
rights and for recognition of our sovereignty, but not petitioning Canberra or Melbourne for that brief period. So really interesting, I think, discussion that brings up. Obviously, we could be here for a whole hour on the
questions of sovereignty,
Indigenous sovereignty and the Crown and how that looks. But this kind of feeling that we are. I'm sitting here on my country, on Wiradjuri country. It's sovereign Wiradjuri country. We've never ceded that. It's always been Wiradjuri country. It always will be Wiradjuri country. I'm in that Closing the Gaps jumper that has that slogan on it right now. But I think it speaks to an important point, that this idea of sovereignty,
yes,
is so deeply embedded in the constitutional document.
Indeed.
About the Crown, not about us.
Yeah. And I guess this is a nice segue into that tension that you've just discussed, is a tension that is broader as well for Australia as an evolving independent nation. So at the time of federation, as we talked about in the citizenship podcast or session, all individuals were British subjects. Indigenous, anyone born in country was deemed by the colonial powers to be British subjects. But in 1949, we also became Australian citizens. And that is part of what you could argue is an evolution to an independent nation. And in 1988, as you referred to, the Commonwealth and the state parliaments passed the Australia Acts to make clear that the English Parliament no longer had power to legislate over Australia and no longer had the executive power over Australia. And each of the states and the Commonwealth concurrently passed the Australia Acts. And in fact, in the cases around Section 44 of the Constitution about dual citizenship, one of the early cases of Sue and Hill in the High Court clarified but from the court's perspective, that anyone who was a British citizen was a foreign national. So that our evolution as an independent nation has been clear, both legislatively and constitutionally in its interpretation of those sections. But we haven't made the complete break in terms of having an Australian as a head of state. And of course, a Republican movement has been about since the 1800s as well. There have been various different political structures advocating for a Republican governance system here in Australia, but its real force, I guess, most recently, of course, was the last referendum.
24 years ago, 1999.
Indeed. So it really is a long period of time since we as a nation have engaged with constitutional reform, and why a podcast series like this is important to remind people of the structures of the Constitution. But that 1999 referendum had two elements, didn't it?
Yes, obviously most of us remember and talk about and debate the merits of the Republic question, and we can get into that perhaps a bit later, especially in upcoming episode on the next referendum, because
Yes.
the idea of a model, Kim, got very much tanked one of the
Yes.
yes case in that referendum.
Indeed.
But the other question, which Kim hinted at, was the Indigenous rights question in 1999, which most people forget about. But it was this question that we insert basically a piece of poetry into the preamble of the Constitution, the non-enforceable bit.
And should I read out the preamble as it is, just for people to gain to recognise the sort of the imbued nature of this as an English document? It says, whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, that's another element that we could also go into, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and under the Constitution hereby established.
Yeah, so that was the section that John Howard sought to amend by including a section about Indigenous peoples and our continued occupation of this continent, but also including migrants as well in that preamble.
Indeed.
Suggested in 1999. And it failed as well. Obviously, it didn't change because Kim just read out the as yet current
Yes.
accurate version.
Yes.
But the proposal was that we seek Indigenous constitutional recognition at the same time as the Republic. But again, this is entirely symbolic recognition. There was no actual effect this was designed to have beyond the mere symbolism. And it failed for a lot of reasons, but it failed for that as a fair chunk of the reasons, because it was seen as ineffectual and not going to achieve any of the changes that us as Indigenous peoples were pushing for via constitutional reform.
Indeed, and so we'll come back to that when we discuss this, the Voice proposal in our final session. But I also just wanted to remind people about the fact that the Republic framework and the Republic, as you said, process had democratic elements to it. There was actually a constitutional convention in 1998 where half of the people were appointed by the government of the day and half were elected. And there was quite a deliberative process in terms of the model. And in fact, that was the basis that it fell apart, because the model had different supporters in terms of whether it be by direct election or whether it be by parliamentary appointment, the head of state.
Of course, that was on purpose, though, right, Kim? The design of the convention in 1998 was so, because John Howard was the PM, he did not want a republic, but was kind of pushed towards the referendum. So his idea was, rather than ask Australians the question on principle, do you want to become a republic? Yes, no. Then we return to the model later on, the way sort of New Zealand approached their flag referendum a couple of years ago. Instead, they went through this thing of a model, because for those people who support a democratically elected head of state, the idea of a parliamentary selected head of state was out of the question, and vice versa. So when you pick a model in that sense, you split the yes camp, and you get this scenario where a lot of hardcore yes supporters are still out there advocating for a no because of the flaws of the model.
And perhaps one of the salient things to remember is that those direct election people thought that would come back quickly, and in fact we're now 24 years later with the next referendum, so that in thinking about referenda, you have to think in the present and not plan for alternatives further down the track.
Yeah.
That might be one a helpful reminder. But I would encourage any of the listeners to go and have a look at the Australian Republican Movement's website, because the Australian Republican Movement has stayed active, even though it hasn't been a central part of Australian political discussion. But certainly this Albanese government has a minister responsible for the Republic, and the Australian Republican Movement has made recommendations for a directly elected head of state, but that the shortlist be designed by the Commonwealth and state parliaments nominating people who would then be voted upon.
Which again is a change in the model from 1999. 'Cause
Indeed.
I think that was recognised as a failure because it didn't win.
Yes,
I think
there's public support.
Only the ACT was the only jurisdiction to support the
Indeed.
change. Everywhere else didn't. So very much on referendum terms, double loss. No,
Indeed.
None of the states and not the majority of the Australian people.
So I think one of the things that I want to finish off with is the reminder that referendum haven't happened often, and so we need to be very thoughtful in the process of our decision making, but also to remind us that it is possible. One of the motivations of wanting you all to think about the Constitution and how fundamental it is and the way it impacts on our lives is that it is important to change it when the change is needed. And one of the positives that will flow if this 2023 referendum is successful is a reminder to people that we can change the Constitution.
As we talked about in the last episode, Kim, the Constitution is designed to change. The whole point of a referendum is to allow this process for us to have this change. And even on something so pervasively infected as the Crown is in the Constitution, because it really is through almost every section of the Constitution, either the Crown is explicitly or implicitly involved in those sections.
Yeah.
Even something so widespread in the document as that still has the ability to be changed by the Australian people. We can still vote
Indeed.
to change that, and those are still things we have as citizens have the right to do and have the ability to do.
Yes.
If the government so chooses to hold the vote, of course. But it is important to recognise that even something, because we talked about the complexity of the Crown's relationship and the kind of the way in which it does infect almost every section of the Constitution, but that's still not an argument against change per se. It's an argument against something else perhaps, but it does, I think, show that you still can change bits even if it is complex and difficult.
And to think back to the fundamental value of a constitution in the way that it underpins all our laws and influences, the culture of governance in a community. And we as a nation have grown and have changed, and if our constitution doesn't reflect that, then it's not well equipped for managing day-to-day lives in the way that it does.
I do want to end, though, on a paraphrasing of Professor Megan Davis, because this question often gets asked is, well, what if we became a republic first and then moved to the Indigenous question? Because that question has been asked of me. I'm sure, Kim, you've gotten the same question.
Yeah.
The answer to that, and I'm going to paraphrase Professor Davis really badly here, and apologies, Megan. But if we go to a republic without first fundamentally addressing this country's relationship with Indigenous people, the republic we have is not going to be any different to the Commonwealth we've left behind. The relationship with Indigenous people is so fundamental to this country and how it sees itself and how it acts that a failure to address that as a first step isn't going to... The republic won't change meaningfully that relationship in any way unless we address it separately. So this question of what if if this fails, do we move straight to the republic before trying this again? My argument would be, of course, no, because again, as Professor Davis says, there's not much difference if we go to a republic without changing the nature of the Crown or the state's relationship with Indigenous peoples and the long 250-year history of oppression. If we don't address that in some way, how different is the republic to the Commonwealth, to the Crown that we've left behind?
Absolutely. And it's heartening, I think, to also affirm that the Australian Republican movement is headed by an Indigenous and non-Indigenous person as well. So we've got Craig Foster and Nova Peris as the co-conveners of the ARM now.
Who are both also massive supporters of a voice to Parliament as the first step in broader constitutional reform.
This podcast was proudly produced at the University of Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Special thanks to Rach White for her production. If you would like to find out more about the topics discussed in this episode, the Australian Constitution and the referendum on the voice to Parliament, please refer to the show notes for some useful links. The theme music for this podcast series is How to Vote by Patrick Hazler.